Hello, welcome everybody back to the Affect Theory and History and Politics of Emotions reading group. Today we're discussing The Listening Society, A Metamodern Guide to Politics by Hanzi Freinacht. And I'm just going to jump right in with a bit of an introduction to metamodernism before we delve into the book itself. And today I'm going to be talking about the first half of The Listening Society. I have already uploaded subsequent synopses of the second half, and I have also uploaded synopses of the Nordic ideology. But today we're going to be talking about the first half. So, yeah, a few notes on metamodernism first. So, Timotheus Vermeulen and Robin van der Akker have given an overview of metamodernism in their publication Notes on Metamodernism from 2010. They also ran a publication that really explores largely the cultural dimensions of metamodernism, and yeah, that publication has been contributed to by a lot of sort of rogue or post-academics who have either left the academy or decided not to be part of the academy after attaining some amount of academic prowess. And yeah, generally they argue there that metamodernism is a sensibility and an emerging cultural logic that follows from postmodernism. So if you had modernism and then postmodernism is kind of like what we see now as a cultural logic in our world since like roughly the 70s or so. Metamodernism is this emerging cultural sensibility that's taking shape right now that fits today's world. Metamodernism is, they say, a structure of feeling wherein people can sense and feel a change in the world and in the culture around them prior to being able to really reason or articulate that change. So it's felt before it can be named. Structure of feeling, of course, coming from Raymond Williams, who wrote about structures of feeling as, yeah, you can sense a change in the world before you can articulate it logically. So metamodernism is trying to deal with both the condition of metamodernity, that is, developments in our actual world, and it also tries to offer a sensibility for a culture existing within that world. And in this sense, it's similar to modernism or postmodernism, which both describe conditions of the world and cultural sensibilities. It emerges, this postmodern or metamodern world, it emerges in a world that's dominated by both incredible progress and also incredible destruction and risk. So we have new forms of empowerment and expression, which with digital tools and interconnectivity of the internet, but also the many hazards of hyperconnectivity, social media, political echo chambers, and ecological destruction, pandemics, so forth. I mean, I think anyone who's lived through the last few years knows that we live in hazardous times, and metamodernism tries to deal with this strange duality of that coexisting with the incredible forms of progress that we also have. So in this world, a person's life and experiences are always global, yet also always hyper-focused, right? We have the biggest mass markets and mass cultures in history, but we also have some of the most niche subcultures that have ever existed, again, because of the internet. Metamodernism seeks a sort of cultural logic for this overall condition. And as we'll talk about in a bit, Hanzi's particular metamodern politics seeks a politics for this world. So most previous metamodern literature has described the cultural dimensions or emphasized those the most. And Hanzi is really trying to focus on what might a political formation look like in this world. And as such, it asks this question of like, how can we make the world better? First of all, it says the world should be better, and then asks how can we do that, especially when we exist within a culture, a postmodern culture, at least amongst like the advanced academic intellectual people who tend to supply those ideas about, or are supposed to supply those ideas about, what we're supposed to be building. A postmodern world where like many people no longer believe that better is like a thing that we can be objective about, and therefore it sort of stymies building anything collectively and together. Anyway, let's put a bookmark in that because we're going to come back to it a lot when we talk about the synopsis for the book. But I also just want to touch on the cultural level. So on a cultural level, metamodernism describes a sensibility that can be both ironic and sincere at the same time. So it's ironic, like postmodernism, which takes nothing at face value and tends to sort of eschew or reject commitments, ideologies, and beliefs. And it does that because it's rejecting the sincerity of modernism, which, as we know, sought almost always through the imposition of like misguided, unexamined logics and universals, but nevertheless sought to shape the world for the better. Okay, so postmodernism arises out of the failures of modernism, and likewise, metamodernism arises out of the failures of postmodernism. But it does so by absorbing aspects of its predecessor and pulling that into itself, trying to hold in productive tension the sort of polar qualities of postmodern irony and modern sincerity, and finding something of a virtuous tension in these. Okay, so moving more to the book now, and a little bit about the book's context and background. So, Listening Society, a Metamodern Guide to Politics, is written by the pseudonymous author Hanzi Freinacht. So, Hanzi Freinacht is, in fact, a fictional character invented by two real authors, basically two Scandinavian political theorists, and I'll respect their anonymity here, I suppose. But the book was published in 2017 and is the first of a series of books, not all of which have been published yet, on metamodernism and particularly metamodern politics. So there's this book, which is fundamentally about what should inform the creation of a political apparatus of the future, a sort of metamodern society, what its politics should look like. There's the next book, The Nordic Ideology, which was published in 2019, which explores the political development of this proposed metamodern society. So what might that actual formation look like, and what type of sociology might go along with it. And then they're planning two more books, The Six Hidden Patterns of History. We don't know when that's going to come out, I don't think. And Outcompeting Capitalism will be the next one. So focusing on the Listening Society, it's generally about the stages of development of the individual, whereas the Nordic ideology will be about the stages of development of society. And together, these books are intended to sketch out both the emerging logic of metamodern culture and the possible form that society will take as a result of developing this metamodern culture. So the reason we're reading The Listening Society in this affect theory group should be somewhat apparent just from the start, with this idea of metamodernism being this sort of structure of feeling that emerges prior to being able to be sort of logically articulated. But another big part of the reason is that the book deals extensively with emotions and feelings, actually proposing optimal emotional and psychological states that everyone in society should strive for. And we'll get to this in a bit, but probably most of that discussion will be in the part 2 synopsis of the book, but we will touch on it today. So, yeah, in order to understand what Hanzi is getting at with his proposals for emotions and feelings, we have to understand a bit more about the concept of metamodernism. And in order to get an understanding of the concept of metamodernism, we need to understand what has come before it, so modernism and postmodernism. And so I'm going to deal with, I've already given something of an outline of how this generally works, but I'm trying to now give the book's framing of this, which is similar but not identical. So just to preface, metamodernism is both a philosophy and a developmental stage of society, they say. So, and we'll talk about this idea of development a bit more, actually quite a lot more in a moment. But according to Hanzi, metamodernism is the overall condition and disposition of a society that has reached a certain level of complexity. So metamodernism refers to its culture, its philosophy, and its developmental stage. And most of this book dwells on metamodernism as a philosophical paradigm, which becomes possible, desirable, and useful with the rise of the internet, globalized culture and exchange, planetary scale processes and their crises, and the cultural complexity and cultural fragmentation of an extremely diverse, unequal, and interconnected world. So again, a lot of parallels with how other thinkers are thinking about metamodernism. So the complexity of our world demands metamodern philosophical paradigm in order to understand and overcome its crises, and in order to sort of advance society to a new stage. So you can think of it as like society itself becomes too complicated for its like previous culture, and then you need to develop a culture that can cope with that new level of complexity. And metamodernism proposes to do just that. So metamodernism as a philosophical paradigm is the stage beyond postmodernism, which is itself the current increasingly dominant philosophical paradigm. And postmodernism is itself, as we talked about earlier, a stage beyond modernism, which continues to be the shaky and unstable paradigm that perhaps became dominant in the early 20th century, and in whose shadow society continues to exist, they argue. Hanzi, that is. And so modernism, just to sketch that out schematically, is a belief in universal reason and rationality, in the belief that the world should operate according to this reason and rationality, which allows it to be quite prescriptive. You know, the modernist says, this is the way to do things, and there are worse ways and better ways, and we should do the better ways and forget the worse ways. But in the second half of the 20th century, postmodernism comes along and basically turns this on its head. That universal reason that informs your plans and designs of the world, this is what postmodernism sort of taunts. That's just Western colonial capitalist rationality that you're imposing on everybody else. It is not universal. It is one of many truths, and you are just more powerful and able to basically impose your version of universality on everybody else. So the postmodern attacks and critiques the foundations of universal truths, especially concerning human nature, civilization, and social structures. And it is, in short, suspicious of grand narratives. Indeed, it downgrades many truths to the status of mere narratives. And this is why postmodern theory is so preoccupied with linguistics and semiotics. It's less interested in truth than it is with meaning and the making of meaning and the power through which one exercises, and those who are powerful are able to exercise through meaning, and how bottom-up ways of taking over meaning can be resistance to that. So affect theory, I think offers, and we've been reading a lot of affect theory, but offers a way of doing metamodern thinking. So one of the recurring themes that we've touched on is how the affective turn, that is the turn in social theory that's given us affect theory, actually breaks out of the so-called linguistic turn of postmodern and post-structuralist thought. So Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, whose writings helped to catalyze the affective turn, who are generally seen as postmodernists, by the way, like high postmodernists, they are less interested in what something means than what it does. And similarly, affect theory, following from this, is less concerned with what things mean than how they feel. And as we've discussed, this has given rise to political analysis that thinks less in terms of coherent political ideologies and more in terms of affective and emotional resonances and even manipulation, right? So much of our politics, you'd be wrong-headed to analyze it through the lens of logic. You need to analyze it through the lens of feeling. And we could perhaps discuss at some point this relationship between affect theory and metamodernism later, but I might just say that I think affect theory is in some sense a kind of emergent metamodern thinking, or at least is going to play a major role in metamodern philosophy, and indeed already is. So anyway, back to modernism. So modernism arose with the rise of industrial society and mass production. That is, with what you might call modernity. And postmodernism comes into being with the rise of flexible production, increasingly globalized trade and information flows, the deregulation of finance, and the proliferation of easily reproducible multimedia, a condition that David Harvey diagnoses as postmodernity. Again, seen as a condition in the actual world. And as you can see, philosophical paradigms track onto and follow along from these societal developments. Okay, so metamodernism, metamodernity then emerge, as I mentioned, sort of alongside each other within the complexities and the significant challenges and crises of the contemporary world. And it is, in no small part, born out of a dissatisfaction with postmodernism's failures to grasp or resolve these challenges and crises. So Hanzi zeroes in on the fact that postmodernism, in its perpetual critiques of foundations and universals, is not particularly good at building, right? It's great at tearing things down, but it's really not good at building consensus. It's not good at building coalitions, and it's not good at building governance structures. It is way better at tearing things down than building things up. And I think this really shows in the contemporary world of politics, where, you know, conservatives are quite good at being like, you know what, let's like just believe this, that we can like build a coalition, we can put our differences aside, but like people on the left tend to really not be able to do this. And a lot of people would blame that on postmodernism. And this is a huge flaw in a world where climate change, ecological crisis, rising inequality, political polarization, and cultural fragmentation all pose existential risks to human civilization and indeed to life on this planet. These are not social constructions. These are real things. And if you're going to try to use the postmodern toolkit to address this, it's going to be woefully inadequate. So a bit about postmodernism's significance and how metamodernism can actually carry this work forward. So postmodernism is still extremely useful, which is why it is steadily taking over the world, at least the academic world, still dominant there at least, and becoming increasingly the dominant ideology outside of the academy, even if it hasn't quite achieved this yet. There are still all kinds of arrogant, arbitrary hierarchies in place and universals in place that deserve to be torn down and replaced. Some version of this kind is happening all over the place. And this is what conservatives are usually referring to when they lament the rise of woke cancel culture, is the rise of a politics that's informed by postmodernism. But it's not just conservatives. A lot of people are deeply disenchanted with postmodern identity politics, and not always for shallow, disingenuous, or reactionary reasons. What metamodernism offers, in my estimation, is a way of navigating our way out of the contradictions and tensions of postmodernism and postmodernity without backsliding into the arbitrarily chosen hierarchies and norms of modernism, or even worse, into pre-modern traditionalist dogma and superstition. And we see these things rearing their ugly heads with much furor today, arguably as a reaction against both the condition and crises of postmodernity and the perceived cultural and philosophical threats of postmodernism. I hope that makes sense. So metamodern politics allows us to build something. And so whereas postmodernism seems poised to critique, redistribute, reconstruct, and call out, metamodernism is poised to understand conflicts from all sides rather than immediately demonizing one side for their privilege or their backwards views. It seeks to understand the reasons and feelings underneath various positions and to address these at their root. It's less concerned with winning than it is with understanding and resolving, and I think that's very important. It seeks to get beyond the incredibly polarized politics of the postmodern world, and to adopt a transpartisan attitude towards politics and culture, as Hanzi puts it. In this sense, then, it's not simply a denial or a rejection of postmodernism, but actually incorporates the goals and aims of postmodernism into itself in order to maintain its accomplishments while overcoming its shortcomings. So in this sense, metamodernism is not, unlike postmodernism, it is not anti-normative. It is, you might say, meta-normative, or in search of norms that are not arbitrary, domineering, and oppressive. It seeks for a historical agent, as Hanzi describes, something that Marxism has often theorized in the proletariat. You have this like working class agent who's the agent of history. And for Hanzi, and by the way, this should make any reader of postmodernism, like myself, uncomfortable in your first pass with this book. Hanzi's looking for a new historical agent, and he looks to Nordic countries and the subcultural milieus of global cities like San Francisco, London, Berlin, and indeed Black Rock City to locate the kind of prototypes for metamodern sensibilities, and tries to find there this historical agent, that is, the people who are going to initiate a shift in the philosophical sensibilities of our world. These places, as the most interconnected and developed places on the planet, this is his framing, not mine. And let me just say, I'm going to try to present his frameworks here uncritically. I'm not going to pause and talk about how, oh, this has problems or this has issues or this potentially brings up this critique. I'm going to try to skip that for time. But know that I hold plenty of critiques, and I'm sure you do too. So these places, he says, are the most interconnected and developed places on the planet, and they host a class of people who he says are stumbling their way into meta-modern ways of thinking and feeling. They are an anti-bourgeois, post-materialistic, meta-modern aristocracy, he tells us, that actually can challenge the hegemony of sort of the middle class or bourgeoisie. He sees them as a kind of vanguard who he hopes will organize themselves into a transnational party that seeks to pull the rest of society into their advanced thinking and feeling. And again, I winced at this part of the book, even if I was simultaneously grateful and excited to see a theory that sort of considered these circles of people as a potential historical agent. I think it's also worth mentioning that Hanzi is bold, but he's not naive. He addresses head-on the anticipated outrage that this book is going to generate for perhaps reproducing, in some people's minds, something that looks like Western chauvinism and elitism. So what he has to say here in his own defense certainly made me feel better. I don't think it fixes everything, but he says that he's not arguing that this aristocracy should have more power in order to enrich themselves, but that they are and should have influence over society's development, because the emergent norms in these communities are the closest thing to a non-zero-sum program for the planet that we have. I'm not sure if this is true, but I think there's something in this line of reasoning, and that is his line of reasoning, and I'm giving it to you in this synopsis. So this leads to another major departure from postmodernism in the book, where Hanzi is, in fact, endorsing hierarchies, but he's doing so in a way that rejects exploitation. And I think this is an extremely rich notion that strangely evades most contemporary thinking. So whereas postmodernism rejects hierarchy, metamodernism embraces it, but in a more sort of self-aware and self-critical way. And in Hanzi's mind, this is a justifiable form of hierarchy. And this is where his theory of stages of development comes in. In defense of cultural relativism, and we can debate whether or not we want to attribute this relativism to postmodernism or postmodernity, Hanzi offers four dimensions of this is in defiance of cultural relativism. He offers four dimensions of human development that he says are inherently hierarchical. So in other words, it is better for both yourself and our civilization to be higher up on these scales of development than lower down on them. This is something, again, that would never fly in postmodernism. But for metamodernism, this is essential, and it represents a paradigmatic shift, because within postmodernism, it is effectively impossible to say that a particular way of doing things, a particular way of thinking or being, is better than other ways. Hanzi's saying, Hanzi's metamodernism is going there and doing this, and advocating this. So let's get into this distinction between hierarchy and power. So hierarchy, not in power, but in principles, is, according to Hanzi, the most just, most ethical, and most kind route. To not say that some things are better than others is essentially to condemn millions of people to horrible lives. You need standards, he says, to improve people's lives, because otherwise there's no direction in which to improve their lives. So to refuse a hierarchy of principles, he insists, is to cave into the destructive, unjust, life-sucking, emergent processes that concretely devastate life on this planet. And we talked about some of those existential risks, tragedies of the commons, and so forth. Our current way of doing things produces hurt, ineffectual, and stunted people on a massive scale, he says. He also says that, in effect, we just waste human potential on a mass scale and cause untold personal and interpersonal turmoil because we fail to create a complex, happy, and deep set of human beings in an interconnected culture that can deal with its problems. So without a framework for doing what sort of welfare looks like, we're flying blind. And if we are going to build a framework for dealing with these problems, we're going to need a set of principles and values to guide us in doing so. Okay, so the ultimate goal of listening society is fundamentally that he's seeking to find guiding principles for developing the welfare apparatus of a metamodern society. In other words, we should build government institutions ideally on an international scale, and they should follow a core set of principles. And this he delivers. What those specific things should be, he delivers in the second half of the book. So he gets into stage theories. So a key contribution of the Listening Society is his promulgation of stage theories, which he calls a model of hierarchical complexity, which he takes from Ken Wilber. And he offers one stage theory concerning cognitive development. He offers another concerning learning and knowledge. He offers another on emotional well-being. And finally, one on wisdom or breadth of experience. Also, something he also calls depth. So the names he gives these four stages are cognitive development, code, state, and depth. And he argues that there are scales of development within all four of these, and we should push people to be more advanced, more developed on these scales, rather than less advanced or less developed on these scales. And together, all four of these scales combine into what Hanzi calls one's effective value meme, which just means it's a complicated way, basically, of saying your overall stage of development. Anyway, these stages of development are the core of the Listening Society's metamodern politics. And let me just say one more thing about hierarchy here. The point of these stages isn't to say that people who are at a higher stage are better than people at a lower stage. The point is to say that it is better for you and for society to be at a higher stage, and we should therefore build the institutions that facilitate bringing the population up to these higher stages. It's important to clarify, too, that Hanzi does that these stages are not the same things as phases. So phases describe sort of normative sequences in life, such as infancy, childhood, education, career, old age, etc. But stages build upon one another, so transcending and including the earlier stage, Hanzi says. And this is really important for Hanzi. The higher stage does not merely abandon, refute, or move on from a lower stage. It actually incorporates its logic and ethos into its newer, higher form, while also overcoming the lower stages' contradictions and or problems. And for those of you who have read Hegel, this sounds a lot like Hegel because it's very informed by Hegel. But yes, that is the core of what he is arguing. I will leave it there, and please go watch part 2, or come to the session on part 2, where we'll talk more concretely about what this metamodern politics might look like. But this was just to offer something of an overview or an introduction to the book, and hopefully with a nice cap about what metamodernism generally is. If you're still confused about what metamodernism is and what metamodernity are, again, go check out that Timotheus Vermeulen and Robin van der Akker's publication, Notes on Metamodernism from 2010. You can Google it. It's free online. I hope this helps to get you started. Thanks.